Okay. My people, my
Name first, please.
Toby Hollenberg, and my grandparents immigrated here. So my parents are first generation American. Both of them were born here, although they each had siblings who were born in Europe. My father's parents were from Romania, I think Bucharest, and my mother's parents were from Russia, Poland, because the borders kept changing, and I talked to my aunts and my relatives, and this one says it was Russia, that one says it was Poland. I think Poland, though, because their last name was something like Schmetchakowski, and it became Friedman when they came here. So we have a passport from my grandfather's cousin, perhaps, that was a Schmetchakowski. And anyway, so I don't know anything beyond that. I don't know what their life in Europe was like. My grandfather on my father's side was a carpenter, and I didn't know either of my grandfathers. And both of my grandmothers died before I was 9, so I have little bits of remembrance of them. And I said I had relatives who were born in Europe, but only one uncle would have been born there that I would have known, and I wouldn't have ever thought to question him about it. By the time he was gone, I wouldn't have thought.
So before I actually ask you about moving to Savannah, would you tell me a little something about growing up Jewish wherever it is that you did grow up, and if you ever experienced any anti-Semitism?
Grew up initially in Brooklyn, New York, so most of the people that I knew were Jewish, although my best friend to this day, we've known each other since we're 4, was Catholic, but they had most of their friends were Jewish. And so being Jewish just sort of existed for me. We celebrated Passover, and that's about all I remember as a young child. Then we moved to Lakewood, New Jersey. Now, Lakewood today is a bastion of Orthodox Jewry, and it gradually became that as I grew up, although I lived outside of Lakewood, belonged to a Reform congregation because my aunt and uncle who lived next door to us were very, very active in the temple. My aunt was the sisterhood president, and my uncle sang in the choir, and he sang Kol Nidre every year. So we connected that way. It's interesting because my father could care less about organized religion. He had experienced anti-Semitism, and growing up in a very Orthodox, traditional home, totally rejected it. And so my sister and I sort of fought to stay connected to the Jewish organized environment. And we sang in the children's choir, and I had a positive experience, relative to being Jewish. My high school, though, and grammar school were very non-Jewish, but I had a few Jewish friends and lived on a chicken farm in Lakewood, New Jersey, and everybody up and down there were maybe 4 or 5 farms in a row, all of whom were owned by Jewish families. So I connected with that. My aunt and uncle sort of helped us. We had Passover there every year, and the high holidays we observed, etc. So I had a strong Jewish identity, and I knew that I would want to marry somebody Jewish.
I'm amazed at the idea of farms owned by Jews, because traditionally historically, Jews were not always allowed to own land. How did they settle into farms?
Well, I don't know, but New Jersey had quite a few areas that the Jewish farmers, Jewish people came and particularly started chicken farms. Ironically, my grandparents on my mother's side moved to upstate New York, to Accord, New York, which is in the Catskills, and they had a dairy farm. They had a lot of land. They moved from New York. He was a tailor initially and then became a farmer. And my understanding is that one of my cousins wrote an article that they trained some of the chalutzim up there before Israel, in the beginning of Israel, they would come to my grandparents' farm. My grandparents on my mother's side were very, very religious, very Orthodox, and a lot of the Orthodox would come and stay at their home, for Shabbos or whatever, being up there. So I know what you're saying, but there was a movement I think and this would have been in the 40s and 50s, sort of right after the war, for Jewish people to go. I mean, it was an hour and a half or so from New York City, and then they became the Eggmen, and they became and then went out of business when some of the larger North Carolina.
Did they sell the chickens? Were they for kosher
We
meat?
sold the egg. No, it wasn't kosher. No, we sold the eggs. We sold the eggs and we ate the chickens.
Really, this has nothing to do with the interview that I planned for you, but you're the first person to mention chulutzim. So my question is, although you would have been really very young, do you remember the atmosphere around the acceptance or non-acceptance of Israel as a state from the adults around you?
Not at all. Absolutely no. So what was going on at my aunt and uncle and grandmother's place was something that I was removed from. I mean, we would go there, but I wasn't aware of any connection until much, much later, when an older cousin of mine wrote an article about it and shared it with the family, because she remembered she was 20 years older than I was, so she had a remembrance of it. My uncles on my mother's side, though, they were activists. My parents also, and they fought in the Lincoln Brigade, went over to Europe, and knew Hemingway, and Margaret Burke White apparently came to our place in Accord, New York. But again, I know this only after the fact, and I have pictures of my parents, though, who were involved with a group that was possibly the forerunner of the NAACP, and union kind of stuff. So, but I don't remember that actively as a child. I just see it through pictures, and I think it was before I was born.
I want to come back to activism and the role that Judaism plays in leadership, and certainly you epitomize that. But before we do that, let's get a little bit more history. And tell me, how did you end up in Savannah?
Steve and I, my husband Steve and I, when he was getting ready to retire, actually I wound up retiring a little bit before he did, because my father was ill, and I just, I was going to spend more time with my dad. And Steve fortunately had the opportunity to retire with a full retirement benefit from GE at age 55. But he wanted to retire to a private golf course community not in Florida. Those were his parameters. And he didn't want to go. I mean, he had traveled to all these, many beautiful golf course communities on business with GE over the years. And so he didn't want to go somewhere where corporate people would be coming to play golf. And, he wanted a real community. And I wanted a community where I could get involved in things. I wanted a substantial, a community of substance, not just a suburb. And Florida, to me, represented development after development after development. So prior to his retirement, he was at a meeting, and somebody mentioned the Landings. Their parents had lived here, or were still living here. And so Steve got on a computer and checked it out and said, wow, this sounds like exactly what we're looking for. We had lived in Rome, Georgia before, had come to Savannah only once, but didn't really have a sense of Savannah. So Savannah was really still new, and we kept saying, we're going to retire to Georgia? Really? So we were living in upstate New York at the time, but we'd moved all over the country. And we came down like the week after we retired. We said, well, let's go. And even though it was a cold February weekend, we said, we think this is it. We looked a couple of places in Florida on the West Coast, Sarasota, whatever, just to give it a shot. Looked in Pinehurst, and that was it.
What was your first memory of Jewish Savannah, positive or negative, when you came here?
Friend of ours from upstate had come to Savannah on business and had gone to Mikveh Israel, so had told us about the temple. And the weekend we came to services on a Saturday morning, and Julie Hirsch was conducting services. The rabbi, prior to that, by the way, I called, and I don't know if I spoke with Rabbi Belzer or I spoke with the secretary. I don't remember her name at the time.
Ann Maynard?
No, it was the one before Christy. Teresa
Blankenship?
Yes. But my question was, we're New York Jews, how do we fare in the South? And I got a very positive answer. And then, what about the landings? Do any Jewish people live at the landings? So we got also a very positive answer. And so we stayed at the landings, as I said, went to temple, had a very positive. Turns out that Julie Hirsch and my husband Steve had gone to school in the same town. They both went to school in Potsdam, New York. Julie having gone to SUNY Potsdam and Steve went to Clarkson. And met Myers Rosenthal sitting in front of us. And I remember asking, how long have you been a part of this congregation? He said, 80 years or so. And behind us sat Carol Lee Getz, who happened to be visiting to hear Julie. I mean, she didn't belong to the congregation. But we chatted with them. She wanted to know if we'd ever heard of the landings. That was where we were staying. They invited us to their house that night. And it was like, wow, this is incredibly friendly and how amazing. So when we came, joining, we wanted a Reform congregation. And so joining Mikveh Israel and being a part of Mikveh Israel was just sort of a natural, we just sort of eased into it very comfortably. And through the Getzes, I guess, at the same time Jewish Women in the Landings was forming. So I had been in contact with Eileen Lobel even before we moved here, and then went to the very, very first meeting they had. It was like a month after we got here. So that gave me an instant connection to 50 Jewish women who were at that meeting. And
compare for me a little bit about the difference being a Jew in the North or other places that you've lived and a Jew in Savannah. What were the things that you thought were incredibly wonderful, and what were the things in which we were lacking?
Coming to such a historic congregation as Mikveh Israel, to me, created an environment that you wouldn't find anywhere else. And Steve and I were both taken with the history of the Jews here in Savannah. So comparing it to Jewish life in the North, where you sort of take for granted that you're Jewish, although we lived in smaller communities, and so we always had to, especially, we lived in St. Louis, we lived in Kansas City, and connected immediately with the Jewish community, and we're very fortunate both places to have Jewish neighbors. And so being connected to Jewish life was always something that was important, especially once the kids were born. Prior to that, not so much, but when we, although not true, we belonged to the little Jewish synagogue in Rome, Georgia. And I really felt more connected to Jewish life here because you sort of had to work at it. You weren't just surrounded by Jews and Jews by virtue of the fact that you lived in a certain neighborhood necessarily, although here, I suppose that could be said of certain neighborhoods. But, we were at a different place in our life too. And we had the time and energy to embrace activities and involvements that before we had to relegate to part-time. So right before we retired, we always belonged to a congregation, and it was a little town in Albany, in Clifton Park, New York, which was a small synagogue, sort of a composite of everybody there who didn't want to travel into Albany itself, the synagogue. Anyhow, I found we've both found it much more. We found ourselves embracing our Jewish life here more than we had. It just was more meaningful, but we also had the time and energy and the desire to focus on it. And so being part of the Jewish community created for us community, and our initial community actually, other than our golf life or some of our social life. But we really sought out the Jewish connection very quickly.
You didn't just become a member. You became so intimately involved in the Jewish community, both you and your husband, may he rest in peace, and that what is it about Savannah? Is there something about Savannah itself that made volunteering here very easy? Or is that something that Jews just do wherever they are?
Good question about Jews doing it wherever they are. I don't know. I did it wherever I was. That was sort of, we moved around the country, so I needed to be the one to get our family established and connected. And so I always volunteered, be it in the kids' school, or I always looked for opportunity to meet people through volunteering. And how that journey started, I sort of don't, I guess I have a little bit of the hint in that when we lived in Rome, Georgia, I met a woman who brought me to a program that was helping kids after school with their homework. And I was a newlywed at age 21, and I wasn't working yet. And so I immediately saw that one can give of one's time in that way. And it just became something I did. I also found that for me, volunteering was often a path to a job. And I had jobs, not a career, because we moved around so much, and I didn't, I had very interesting jobs for me, but very often I volunteered first and then, made those connections. The interesting thing here is I see Jews doing a lot of volunteering, but I really also see a large part of the non-Jewish community doing a lot of volunteering. So it may be easier in a small community because it's easy to find the opportunities or to meet people who are doing things that you then can connect to. I was here having total discretionary time. We both did. We were retiring. We weren't going to work. And so it was, all right, what do we want to fill our time with? And I knew before I came that I wanted community involvement. In fact, one of the first things I did here was involved with the Open Arms Home, but I had seen an article about it in Parade magazine before I moved here. So, that was something I was already looking to do. And then connecting with the Jewish community just sort of fit in because I was meeting a lot of Jewish people.
I moved around a lot as a child, and sometimes it's very difficult for children to...
Sorry.
When you were moving from place to place, did being Jewish, was being Jewish a hindrance or a help as your children kind of work through both the social structure of schools and activities?
I sort of don't think either. I think that it was a balance. Our Jewish life integrated into the other things. Most of the time for my son, his connection was sports. And so he would, and Melissa also found different activities, or the Jewish part of it was always there, but I don't think it made as much of a difference in the kids' lives as it did in mine. And mine more than Steve's. He was working, but I valued the Jewish connection. And they had Jewish friends, but their Jewish involvement was more just Sunday school and not with Jewish social groups. They didn't belong to. I'm trying to think where we were living. We were living in, during their high school years, we were living in a small town in Connecticut that really that had a small Jewish population, and we belonged to to a conservative congregation at that point, so there wasn't youth group stuff that the kids did. So they didn't really get full, and we didn't send them to Jewish camps, which later we thought maybe we should have rethought, but...
Bar bat mitzvah, confirmation?
Both bar bat mitzvah, yeah.
Were these things available to you when you were growing up?
Confirmation was, but I didn't go through confirmation. I don't remember if any of my friends had bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah, certainly. It wasn't anything that was even discussed. Again, my dad really, this was not important. He did it because we wanted it. And so it was, my mother wasn't alive, so it wasn't like there was
There was something so strong that drove me to want to provide Jewish education for myself, even as a child. It also was not prevalent in my household. And it seems like you have some of the same drive, because despite the fact that it was not discouraged but not encouraged from your father, maybe what he was providing wasn't enough. But in terms of what you then turned around to give to your own children, what are the most valuable lessons you think that you taught your children? And were they based in who you are Jewishly, or were they just general lessons?
That's a real interesting question. I think I modeled a caring for Jewish identity. I will admit, our household wasn't, Shabbos was not the main focus in our household. We had, we would do Shabbos meals with friends sometimes, but I didn't grow up with it, and I didn't create it as a Friday night, for example, ritual, which, looking back, would have been a nice thing to do, but it didn't. And yet, I think my children always knew that Jewish connection was important to me. I don't know how, in instilling it in them, it was more, this is what's important to me, and I am exposing you to it. I sometimes think I could have done a better job, but I think to me it was values, which of course are not necessarily Jewish. I think, giving, to me the values are caring for other people and giving of yourself, and mainly that's it, just helping other people, and so I don't quite know how to answer that. I just know that for me, some of the desire to be connected to Jewish life was a sense of wanting to belong. I often felt like an outsider as a kid. I grew up with a very crazy, dynamic in that, by the time I was 17, I'd lost a mother and two stepmothers. So, there was not a heck of a lot of, yeah, you too. So, it was also, I never felt like I was in any, included in anything. So it was really a feeling of, and because my aunt and uncle to me represented stability, and I really I embraced what was important to them too. I wanted to feel part of what I saw they enjoyed in life, that connection. So I don't know, it was just a matter of sense of community.
So many people I talk to talk about, it was just expected that you're the best in class, or it was just expected that you got an education, or it was just expected that you tried harder, or gave back to the community, or gave back to the synagogue, or whatever. What drives you in finding leadership? I assume it's not just that there's a vacuum out there of people who want to do these things, but you have some real skill and talent which you're constantly giving back to many different organizations, not just Jewish organizations. But is there something about who you are Jewishly that makes that your path? Makes that an imperative?
I wouldn't have thought yes. It's sort of backwards. It's that I am what I am because I don't know. Some of it, I don't know why. But when I look at Jewish values and Jewish teachings, I think that now I understand. It's not that I did it because of Jewish values, but I did it, and now the Jewish values confirm that what I've done has Jewish values. you know, as I look at, Jewish, what's important in Jewish life, or what's important to me, what I take out of being Jewish. And yet I certainly see other people who embrace similar philosophies and ways of life that are not Jewish. But it's hard to know. It just becomes what you do or what you are. And I am very grateful to have been given this opportunity, and I think living in Savannah has been a big part of that. I don't know, although I had leadership positions elsewhere, but Savannah has been very special, and the Jewish community in Savannah has been very special in opening up paths, and not opening up paths, but having role models. I mean, you are certainly, one of the most amazing role models of how one gives and gives and gives, and so there being people that open up paths for you, but also that you can follow, that you see by example that this is how one can live one's life and do. And I don't know what motivates one. I didn't have that so much, other than my aunt who, volunteered, so I saw that a little bit. My mother's siblings were interesting people, and one of my aunts was also somebody who very, very involved. My uncle was head of the the JGC, I think it was in Denver, the head of that office. I think that's what it was, one of those committee, one of that group. I don't remember what it was called. But yeah, anyway, so it's a hard question to ask, because I don't know if it's a chicken and egg kind of thing.
I wasn't going to go there because the Lincoln Brigade and the other activism roles that your family played really didn't pertain to you. But what about something a little more closer to home, the civil rights movement, the women's movement? Did either of these impact you either in things that you did, your friends did, or your mentors participated in, and that you thereby learned something from the experiences?
Interestingly enough, no. I'm not an activist. I am not one. I mean, I'm compassionate about these issues, and I care about them, but I've never taken an active role, and have not been involved with many people who have. It's not the path, it's not the direction I seem to go in, or the group of people I would get involved with. Some of it comes from, I don't know, it's not, just like I'm totally apolitical, and I'm just not one to go out there and beat the drums and, be at the forefront of those kinds of things, or be involved in it. So only that I was empathetic and concerned about the message and about the need for equality, and tried to live it and emulate it in things that I did, and values I hope I taught my children.
So, coming back to those children, what are the things that you learned from your father, from the adults around you, that were core values that hopefully came somewhere from your Jewish background, that you hope to impart to your children and grandchildren?
Be kind, give to others. It's interesting, because I recently wrote something to my grandchildren, or wrote something in a book somewhere, that, what would I want them to know that I think are important values. And to me, it's just that you need to think about others and care about others and be generous. And I don't know where it comes into Jewishness. You know, I don't really know how that plays into it or what effect Jewish, because I don't know where it comes from. Maybe it was just a general sense of it. I mean, it wasn't verbally communicated to me. Now, I had a sense that my mother was somebody who cared about the world and, you know, would have, and maybe, you know, was an activist in her early years. So, I don't know. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know what, but it's important to me. It's very important when, you know, I hear the girls or I hear my grandchildren talking about it. I think, well, you know, be charitable, give to others. When my grandson one year, I was so proud of him. I said, "What do you want for your birthday?" He said, "Just make a donation to the Houston Food Bank." So I do that every year for his birthday now, in addition to giving him a gift. And I thought, yes, that's it. That's what I want. You know what? Think about others. We're so fortunate. Count our blessings. And I grew up very, very, you know, on the edge. We weren't poor, but we were hand to mouth kind of people. I mean, we always had a roof over our head. The bills probably got paid, although I don't know that. We always had electricity. You know, I mean, we never starved, but there was no extra for anything. And so, you know, it was that I just feel so amazingly fortunate to be living a life of comfort. You know, I didn't grow up uncomfortable, but it would never
Is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about? And here's your chance.
Yeah. I don't know. No, because I think that if we look at, obviously, connection to Judaism, and it just, I feel fortunate to have found that strong connection. It's not necessarily an intellectual one, because I'm not a studier and I'm not learned. I appreciate what I learn, but I'm not a student of Judaism. And to me, it's a sense of community as a Jew. It's a sense of pride in being Jewish, a pride in being of a people that I feel have strong humanitarian values, and also relating to a compassionate God. And so that's what I pull from it. And the history, I mean, I think the history, certainly here in Savannah, the history is, to me, something I'm so proud of our community.
Thank you very much. Whether you realize it or not, you participate on a daily basis in Tikkun Olam, and you make us all wonder why we're not doing more.